Well, welcome everyone to episode 29 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. I am here today and always quite happy to be here now these days with both Henri Williams and Melissa Ellis. And it's great to see you guys. We were just about to hop on and realizing like it's an hour later, right? We all lost the hour this morning. We're trying to catch up, get a hold of ourselves. And so we're going to just jump right in. We are fresh off our conversation last week around this concept of ethnicity, and Kendi framed it as one more kind of tool, if you will, in the tool belt of the racist power at the top. It gave us new ways of thinking about how ethnic racism ultimately results in all groups losing and creates a vicious cycle of groups scrambling to be at the top of the hierarchy using any means possible, including, of course, as we talked about last week, the disparaging of other groups. So just like last week, I thought we'd start this week with something kind of happening in the world around us that just really helps us tie all the learning we're taking away from Kendi to day-to-day life, right? Which has, of course, been our intention. And is why we end each episode with action items, things that people can do to build off of the learning from that episode. So with that, Henri, I'm going to turn to you because I know that quite a lot has happened, obviously, this week. And you had some kind of thoughts about how to tie some of the things that happened to some of our learning. So I'm going to turn it over to you. It's all you.
Oh, hi, good morning. I'm sorry, you kind of caught me off guard there. So just before we started, as Janice was saying, we were talking and I was saying to her, this has been an interesting week, where you had the at least for me, the high of finally passing this relief bill. And then I listened to President Biden's speech and, was so inspired with the idea that come May, the potential for everyone having access to a vaccine. He proposed the summer, we can actually get together as families because we will be vaccinated, certainly with some cautions, so it was really exciting. And then there's the other side of the coin. And as I listen to some things, and I'll talk about why I'm posing this question. And so one of the things we've been doing in this discussing this book is talking about policy, anti-racism and how it comes around to policy. And we're talking about this week, the body, and you kind of think, well, what does the Black body represent, And I came to this question, then, are Republicans in public office racist? And I throw that out as a question. And the reason I say that is when I talked about the high of the week, we all know that not one Republican person in the House or in the Senate voted for that relief, which included things for children, families, opening schools, access to vaccines, reducing poverty, many, many things. We know that in 43 states that are controlled by Republicans, there's an active campaign to reduce voting rights. Right. In Georgia, they passed a bill that handing someone a bottle of water can cause you to be arrested, while they're voting. We know there's this, I think about the history of the last 4 years under Trump, and people kind of say, well, I'm not like that, but there was silence. Right. And, is silence complicity, and if you didn't feel that way, why didn't you say so? Why didn't you do something differently? And it kind of comes around to, and I think I talked about this last time, this zero-sum thinking, helping you means I lose something,
Yep.
you know, versus this idea that we all benefit. And further on in the book, I think in the chapter where he talks about white people, he actually makes the statement about how hating Black people also harms white people. And, you know, when we get into that, you know, he'll talk about some of the things that really support that. But, you know, I'm throwing that out there. And then I'm going to preface this. I was listening to a podcast and last night, and they did a quick interview, and I'm just going to play it, and then we can go from there.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good.
This was Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson tonight talking about why he wasn't afraid at all during the attack, because he could tell by looking at them that they were all good people who would never break the law.
I'm also criticized because I've made the comment that on January 6th, I never felt threatened, because I didn't. And mainly because I knew that even though those thousands of people that were marching to the Capitol were trying to pressure people like me to vote the way they wanted me to vote, I knew those were people that love this country, that truly respect law enforcement, would never do anything to break a law. And so I wasn't concerned. Now, had the tables been turned, Joe, this could be in trouble. Had the tables been turned and President Trump won the election, and those were tens of thousands of Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters, I might have been a little concerned.
I might have been a little concerned. See, if they'd been Black, that would have been one thing. But these were white men who were convicted felons and members of large white supremacist prison gangs.
So I won't play the whole thing. Anybody can go back and listen to that. But this is a U.S. senator. And so I go back to the question I posed, you know, are Republicans in public office racist?
And can you tell me one more time who the senator was in that clip?
Ron Johnson.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, and Melissa, I can only imagine you've got some. I mean, we're both. Nobody else can see us. We can all see each other, and Melissa and I are like the looks on our faces are
flabbergasted. I am literally flabbergasted. Not just that he has that thought process, because it's a lot more common than people think.
Of course.
And I'm sure we'll delve into that, but that you have the audacity to say it on a public forum and not think a second about it.
Yeah.
Like, that is just a natural thought process that you should be sharing to the public. Wow.
Yeah, you know, and I got to tell you, I'm going to shift us and we're just going to blend this, right? We'll go, back and forth, but right out of the gate in the chapter about the body, and I'll come back in a minute and do some of the definitions from right from the start. But right out of the gate, he puts out a quote from President Clinton, from then President Clinton from 1995, and he said, and the quote is this: "Blacks must understand and acknowledge the roots of white fear in America. There's a legitimate fear of violence that's too prevalent in our urban areas. By experience, or at least what people see in the news at night, violence for those white people too often has a Black face." That was in 1995. And the quote you just shared with us came from this week. And the message is exactly the same. Exactly the same. So, you know, so now the difference is that's a democratically elected, like a Democrat president, right? So your question is, are Republicans who hold all public office racist? And certainly from what you just played and the connections you just made to a lack of support for the relief bill this week, et cetera, there's a kind of a, it would be hard to say answer no to that question, right? I mean, maybe you could answer no to the collectiveness of it, but it crosses all, I mean, it crosses lines, right? It's unfortunately not even as simple as are Republicans who hold office, but the point I'm making is that was in 1995, and here we still are.
And for me, it's politicians,
Yeah.
because I see and I say politician because it's in office. I absolutely see the connection to Republicans and racism, but unfortunately, I also see it to Democrats and racism because because of being complicit. Because I'm waiting. First of all, I'm probably a little out of touch, but I haven't heard that. I didn't hear that was said. I haven't heard an uproar about that. I haven't heard. I haven't seen social media talking about, like, nothing. If Henri had not played that, I wouldn't be aware that a public official holding office made that statement in 2021.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some hush, be quiet and go along, that complicit component on all aspects and from all sides. And it's disgusting. It is absolutely disgusting. But I still cringe at that super predator, which is where that clip, that quote that we discussed, where that came from. That whole super predator conversation, that for Clinton is one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton did not get the Black support that could probably have helped her. Although there's levels to that. There's so many levels to it all.
Yeah. It's certainly not simple by any stretch.
We know that there was some voter fraud as far as back then, and we don't talk about it. But at the end of the day, that was also why she didn't have enough Black support, because unfortunately, Bill's comments were held against her.
Right.
Because everybody thought she was complicit. So I think Henri's bringing up, we could have a whole show on the political part and the role that politicians play in setting the policies and just the tone, because Bill Clinton's conversation kind of gave white America the justification and excuse that they wanted and they needed to continue to be racist towards the Black body. Absolutely.
Well, and going back to the book, and I think one of the themes he wants us, or he at least wants to convey, is how all this plays out in terms of policy and everyone's day-to-day existence. What's disconcerting about, what I said earlier and what I heard is, these are the people who are making those decisions, the policies and the laws. So when you think about, are these the people making the policies and the laws, in spite of, and I think they ran enough polls, and certainly this was brought up in the president's speech, the population was highly in favor. I think you're polling like up in the 70% of most Americans. We want this, we need this. There was even a majority of Republicans that said, we want this, we need this. And yet you come back to the policy makers, the ones who truly have the ability to affect what happens to us in our day-to-day existence, saying no. How do you unpack that?
Yeah.
Well, honestly, that question is a really important one, Henri. How do you unpack it, right? And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, Melissa, your point is so well taken, because even though, like, Henri, right before we hopped on, we were talking about starting the episode this way, and he made the point of, this guy's going to have to get elected again in however long, right? And we live in an era where information doesn't go away anymore. The recording is always there, the video is always there, it's always there, and yet that I'm not comforted by that in a way that suggests that because of that he wouldn't get reelected. So
it may even bolster his popularity with his base. Like, Trump taught us that. Trump showed, or I should say proved, not taught us, but he proved that you can say and do the most asinine things and your base will just be emboldened by it. They will just be enamored with you, because you are giving voice to their fears. You are giving voice to their biases and their prejudices that they've held forever. to their racism. And not only that, I think that's a double-edged sword, because things happen so quickly and get so much attention and then they fade away. And Americans have the attention span of a squirrel in bright lights, and we don't remember, we don't stick to things. Hopefully, when it's time for him to be reelected, someone will bring this up, which I'm sure will happen. But if not, if it just falls to the wayside like everything else in America, where we pay attention for 5 minutes and then we move to the next thing, because I haven't heard of this. I didn't hear about this until this minute. Like, that's why I think my reaction is so all over the place, because this is a real live reaction to hearing that for the first time. But while I'm reacting this way, there are probably plenty of people who would applaud him.
Well, this was just on her Friday night show.
Oh, okay.
You know?
Okay.
So I
Give it
kind
time.
of following her, I think it was a recent interview, you know,
Okay.
so it hasn't maybe been out there very long. But again, you know, going back to the book, and you know, I think we've touched on this. This isn't new. You know, these are the generations of, you know, people that have bought into these beliefs, who have indoctrinated the next generation and the next generation. You know, the issue is that thinking, these beliefs, you know, these concepts, these ideas of the Black body is dangerous and should be feared, you know, gets passed on. And these are the folks who are in position to create laws. I mean, we, and you said this a little earlier, you know, let's talk about justice. So, you know, social justice, racial social justice. When was the last time, you know, a person of color was killed and there was not an indictment, a conviction?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, it's almost assumed they're going to get off.
Yeah.
I mean, I almost hate to say that, you know, because I firmly want to believe in our American system and Constitution and justice. But I also, I look at the data and I look at facts. And the data doesn't really bear that out and support that, you know. So again, you know, this is historical and it continues, you know. And these are the things he talks about in the book. You know?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I don't want to take us down this road yet, because I'm sure we're going to spend some time here. But, you know, here we are again, sitting in a real life scenario of, you know, a white cop about in the process now being tried because jury selection has started in the case of Derek Chauvin. And, you know, that's going to take weeks. And the biggest part of that battle really is about how you're going to get a jury that can be unbiased given the nature of the crime, but also because of the, you know, nature of the effect on that crime globally. And so, you know, like I said, I don't want to take us down that tangent yet, but because I'll know we'll go there. But to your point, Henri, right? It's, you know, there's a really sad part of me in the back of my mind going, spend 3 weeks on jury selection all you want, but how's this guy? I can't imagine how he could not get convicted. 100% can't imagine, but we know historically in this country it's possible.
And just to contrast,
it's likely.
Yeah. And just to contrast that, and you know, I heard this the other day, and I'm like, oh goodness! And it was such an announcement. Every station announced, oh my God, they just won their civil suit, $27 million, highest award ever. And in the context of that discussion, they said, oh yeah, and the Breon family, they got 20 million. And as they're rattling this off, you know, I'm thinking to myself, we can't convict the people who caused the murders, but these cities are paying these families millions of dollars. Help me understand this.
That's right. That's right.
There is no way to understand that, Henri. I mean, I agree with you 100%. Like when you think about I don't even know the right word. I was going to say the duplicity. I don't think that's the right word. But when you think about the contrasting messages from that, yes. And so, well, again, because it makes me think like, okay, so clearly the general consensus among the public, if you will, kind of like you said earlier with the bill, right? Obviously, people of all walks of life needed this relief bill and supported this relief bill. Clearly, from a general public perspective, people believe, yes, this cop killed this person, right? And yet we can't convict them. I mean, I really just. So you've done a great job a couple of times on redirecting us back to the book. So I'm going to take us back there because right in the beginning,
Okay.
this part is really important because he does such a great job of giving us the history. We've talked about that many times. Like so much of this is really about understanding the history. When you understand the history, it helps inform your thinking about what's happening today. But he really actually quickly takes us way, way back and I'm just going to do a quick run through of this, but he talks about that history has told the same story for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? That violence for white people really has too often had a black face. He's tying that to that quote from Clinton that I mentioned earlier. So he goes back to 1631, when Captain John Smith warned the first English coloners of New England that the black body was as devilish as any people in the world. In 1696, so flash forward 60 years, Pastor Cotton Mather preached compliance to slavery. Don't make yourself infinitely blacker than you already are, he said. In 1723, Lieutenant Governor from Virginia spoke of the cruel disposition of those creatures, referring to people who were of the black body. 1861, when Texas was, seceding Texas legislators complained of not receiving more federal funding for protecting against ruthless savages. Again, speaking of people with the black body. 1903, Senator Benjamin Tillman told his colleagues, the poor African has become a fiend, a wild beast seeking whom he may devour. Two leading criminologists in 1967 stated that espoused that the large criminal display of violence among minority groups such as Negroes stems from their subculture of violence. And even as recently in 2016, a Manhattan Institute fellow, Heather McDonald, wrote, the core criminal justice population is the black underclass. That, he says, is the living legacy of racist power, constructing the black race biologically and ethnically. We've already talked about those. And then also presenting the black body to the world first and foremost as a beast, to use, one of the references that we just gave, as violently dangerous as the dark embodiment of evil. That is, where he starts us, because that's important for us to understand that this message has been the message for hundreds of years. And you just, Henri, gave us the most recent example from this podcast you were listening to Friday night, right? When that senator said essentially exactly what all of these people have said, just in different words.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. Just in different words. And so,
as you were going through the history, and the hundreds of years, and bringing it, and I'm listening and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God. And now we hear in March 2021, a senator saying the same thing, literally.
Yeah. Saying the exact same thing. And so it does, I mean, for me, and again, I'm looking forward to the moment when this podcast or a podcast like this can be heard by larger groups of people, because I just think that right there, like for people to realize this thing he just said 2 days ago in 2021 has the same message that Captain John Smith had back in 1631. How is that possible? We know you could at least argue in 1631, there was such a significant level of ignorance because there was a lack of information. People were just basically saying, this is what I think, and now we're going to make it truth by me saying it out loud and because of my position. But now we have so much information. There's just no excuse to be displaying such levels of ignorance. And yet here we are. How is it that that's possible?
Because I'm not sure that ignorance is the root. I'm not sure ignorance is the root. There's some deliberate intention behind.
Of course. Yeah,
messages like that. There is intent.
It's power.
Good point.
And, as you were saying that, I immediately thought about, that intersect of, politics, the constituency, and if this was truly just about politics and wanting to stay in office, then your position would be supporting your constituency. But as I said earlier, the data bears out the constituency says, we want this.
Yeah.
So
exactly right.
your non-support is not even about, even wanting to stay in power, just to put it that way, as a sense. It's about what you maybe inherently believe.
Right. Well, and when you, in the end, when that's the message, right? When that is the clear message, he goes on to say in that same piece, well, then no wonder the Black body had to be lynched by the thousands, deported by the tens of thousands, incarcerated by the millions, and segregated by the tens of millions. So that message is also the excuse, if you will, that we stand on to say, well, this is why, right? And now I'd like to think more of us than not look back at that history and are ashamed by it and recognize how wrong it was. But to both your points, right? If that was the case, then we'd be 100% certain right now that Senator Ron there is going to be boosted next election, and yet we're not, right?
And we'd see cops convicted. We'd see people,
Yeah.
more people upset and voting these people out of office, not just him, but those who think like him. When we see that there's a relief bill on the table that all of us, an overwhelming majority of us were in support of, and they didn't vote for it, meaning they don't care if we can pay our bills, feed our families, clothe our children, we'd get them out of there. And we don't. We repeatedly and it just infuriatingly keep these people in office.
Yeah.
So I'm not as convinced as I wish I were that that the majority of us are aware and are different and care.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
Well, and he does, and again, these are the consistent threads, right, that I'm pulling, because the next consistent thread that he puts back on the table again is this messaging hasn't just hit home with whites. It is absolutely the messaging that has been inherently absorbed, if you will, by Blacks as well. And he talks about his own parents, which he does a lot. He comes back to them. And he talks about that in their constant, as he turned age 8 and older, right, getting a little bit old enough to be able to like walk out into the community on his own and those kinds of things. And he says their constant fear mongering about Black drug dealers, robbers, killers, that constant fear mongering nurtured in me a fear of my own Black neighbors. So again, it's the whole dueling consciousness piece he keeps bringing us back to, that, even somebody walking around in a Black body, as a young man walking around in the Black body, he was scared of other people with Black bodies because of the messaging.
Well, in a future chapter, he does 2 chapters. He does one on whites, and then he does a chapter on Blacks. And in the Black chapter, I think he opens up with a question, can Black people be racist? And he kind of talks a little bit about what you touched on, that even within the Black community, there's a them and us,
Yep.
And sometimes I'm embarrassed to say I went through some of that myself,
Me too.
But again, I said, my family was that immigrant family that came here and quickly distinguished themselves from the folks who had been here. And, my grandmother really indoctrinated this them and us, and he talks about that in that chapter, this idea of, well, you're not like those Black people, but he uses a different word.
Right.
But, it's this whole idea of the Black body, I just keep coming back to this, the Black body and what it represents. And I'll interject something real quick, if I may.
Of course.
I watched the movie United States versus Billie Holiday. I don't know if any of you had a chance to watch it.
Just a piece of it.
All right. And so the backdrop of the movie is about her fight with the federal government, the FBI, and her decision to sing the song Strange Fruit. Which, as you know, is about lynching. And but the part I just wanted to mention is in the beginning of the story, they talk about how And I can't remember the year, but easily over 50, 60 years ago, there was an anti-lynching bill brought up in Congress that didn't get passed. Here we are in our current time, and they've tried to introduce an anti-lynching bill, and they still can't get it passed.
Yeah.
And yes, this is a fact. And the holdup of passing the bill happens to be Republicans. And you know, and you think about, why would anyone be opposed to a bill that, because it came after the George Floyd, and yeah, and why would anyone be opposed to anti-lynching or any representation of anti-lynching?
Again, I'm going with Melissa on the flabbergasted. I don't have a better word.
It'll keep you there. It'll keep you there.
Because now, and Henri, one of the many things I value about the connection we have now over this podcast is you're such a font of kind of knowledge about the things that are happening right this moment. You know, I aspire to be you with respect to how can I, and that's a common thread of our conversation, right? Part of the action we all have to take is to be more informed. And here I am. I know I'm working to be more informed, and yet I feel like I'm a teeny tiny little bit more informed compared to, you know, the broad kind of swath of kind of current events, if you will, but current news that, you know, is happening around the world or here in our country. But so yes, I'm sitting here kind of going to myself, did I even know that? Nope, didn't know that. And so, but that's the kind of stuff that we should all know, like every single day that should be at the forefront, and it's not. So.
But I have to say though, Janice, that while I agree with that, there's a reason we don't know. And I think that there's several reasons we don't know. I think number one, we don't know because it's purposely not placed out there for us to know in an easy way. Like if you're not someone that's following the news, you wouldn't know. It's not, because it doesn't get the attention it should. Something like that should have been all over everything. Those people who voted against it should have been identified. Yes, people should be making a grander effort to be informed as well, but I feel like number one, it's purposely not put out there for the masses to know, and number two, because there's so many incidents like it. Like there's so much that's going on that is embarrassing and disgusting and all of that at the same time. Like it's all
that's a good
swirling
point.
around, and people just have to kind of grab the, you know, and that's another reason that, as I mentioned earlier, we don't stay on one issue very long, because before we know it, here comes another, and then there's another, and before we know it, there are like 5 or 6 of them on the table that we should be outraged about, but we can't be outraged about everything at the same time.
Well, and one of the biggest examples right now in my mind, and Henri, you said this earlier, right now, I think it's 43, right? 43 states that there are voter restriction laws being on the table in an effort to pull back, and some just, and one more ludicrous than the next, right? I really am struggling to figure out why we feel the need to restrict. I really am. In this day and age where we just went through an election that proved it's really hard to commit voter fraud in this country, right? We both proved that it's hard to, and proved that when you claim it's happening and it's not really happening, we can prove that too. And yet we have legislators all over this country spending a lot of time right now trying to figure out how to restrict.
Well, it's sad because I think one of the attorneys representing these restrictions, I think it's in Arizona, and don't quote me, but paraphrasing, he said something to the effect, without these things, we can't win. And, so the subtext of that discussion is, if you had a open, fair, non-gerrymandered election, their concern is the folks we want in office wouldn't get elected. Now, I can understand your thinking. However, that's not democracy.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I'm going to take us back in again, because as we're chatting, I'm kind of going through my notes with the chapter just to pull out the things that are connecting to what we're saying. And this actually, it connects across all of it, but certainly connects back to a couple of minutes ago where we were talking about the rate at which like you said, Henri, we have all these Black families getting money for the deaths of their loved ones, but we can't seem to convict anyone. So he talks about this statement that he makes just really gets at me. But on page 73, he says, he's talking about being with his, he's a teenager now, and he's talking about being with his Black friends and being in scenarios that happen with them, et cetera. And again, this is all focused on the Black body. But he says, we were unarmed, but we knew that Blackness armed us, even though we had no guns. Whiteness disarmed the cops, turned them into fearful potential victims, even when they were approaching a group of clearly outstrapped and anxious high school boys. So he says specifically, he gives us these pieces of data. Black people comprise 13% of the US population. And yet in 2015, Black bodies accounted for at least 26% of those killed by police, declining slightly to 24% in 2016, 22% in 2017, and 21% in 2018. Again, still only comprising 13% of the population, which apparently, he said, look armed. So he's talking again about Black bodies, which apparently look armed to fearful officers, are about twice as likely to be killed as unarmed white bodies. So unarmed Black people, twice as likely to be killed.
This is why this chapter was so important to me. I mentioned last week that I was eager to get into this chapter. And this is the reason. And I've said on this podcast in the past that it was the Trayvon Martin murder that opened my eyes to a lot of the police brutality. And this chapter is exactly why. There are tons of stories out there, Trayvon's being the one that I think opened most people's eyes.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's my perspective because it had such a profound impact on me. But him and Tamir Rice are the first two names that pop into my head.
Right.
Because as Black children, and it is well documented, well researched, data supports it, Black children are seen as adults much faster, much quicker than white children in this country. They are treated as adults. They are viewed as adults. They are given messages that are meant for adults, like, don't cry, buck up, man up, all this other stuff. And this is why, because the Black body is seen as this fearful, menacing thing, and we can't attach that to youth. So they immediately begin viewing them as men or as adults. Even the size of Black bodies is something that is used to demonize. I think about Michael Brown. When he was killed, one of the things that the officer who killed him tried to use was that Mike was this big, hulking Black man coming for him, and he was so afraid, when the fact was they were similar in height.
Yeah.
All right, just saying that the two of them being the same height, no one took that in consideration. Instead, they all bought into this idea that Michael Brown was somehow bigger and more menacing. And so that is exactly why we say all the time, it's upsetting that these officers keep getting acquitted, but that's why they can get acquitted. Yeah. They can get acquitted because of this very mindset that we're talking about, that Black people are somehow more dangerous and should be feared. So when these officers use that raggedy excuse of, I was in fear of my life, although I had a weapon,
right?
Although I'm the trained officer, although I'm being paid to not be afraid or to act in spite of my fear, people buy that excuse from them, that they were afraid for their life or their lives, and therefore that was their only course of action, was to defend themselves.
Yep.
And we perpetuate that still. Yep. But I have to say, I find it, I really need to keep saying this out loud. If Black people were as dangerous as white people think they were, white people would already be gone. Like, we'd be attacking. When you look at the history of this country and all that has been done by white people to Black people, not the reverse, not Black people to white people. When you look at all that has been done to the Black race by whites, they'd be gone if we were as dangerous as they say we are.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And that, honestly, Melissa, that seems so simple, right? Like that thought, that line of logic, it seems that simple. But, and again, and And he keeps driving us to it, and I keep driving us to it for the same reason, because it's, you know, you kind of step back and you ask yourself, but how, like you said, how can, if based on what you just said, yes, if people who have black skin were that dangerous, we'd have a very different looking country right now, like you said, right? Like it would be completely different. But again, so it's kind of like, so how can we continue to have those misconceptions in our head? And again, part of it is that we know it's the consistent messaging, but it's also that it's the people in power, and he's been very consistent about this notion of racist power, have constantly reiterated it, right? So he takes us back again to 1993 and Clinton's Violent Criminal and Law Enforcement Act. And there, he walks us through the history of the passing of that law, which, by the way, essentially in and of itself took away any potential opportunity for education and rehabilitation, and put all the money into getting as many people in jail as possible. And we know what that means. We know that means getting as many Black people in jail as possible. And he talks about the way that Congress and the Black Caucus engaged around that bill, because the Black Caucus, of course, was pushing very much for, okay, so we'll support it if we get this much money for drug treatment and this much money for violence prevention programming, et cetera. And in the end, even that Black Caucus had to compromise way beyond what, when we look back now, should have ever been considered as compromise. But he points out again, that in part was due to their own dueling consciousness. If as a Black man, I fear the Black body in my own ways, then I am also more susceptible, you know, just like white people are, to this idea that the Black body is dangerous. Go ahead, Henri.
Yeah, you know, and you know, this whole idea of the Black body dangerous, and you know what you were saying earlier, Melissa. You know, so I grew up in New York City, much like his parents, and a lot of the stories he tells, I remember. And in fact, it's funny, as we're talking, I remember. So I was fortunate. I grew up in the South Bronx, but I went to school in Lower Manhattan, which meant, you know, I had to take the subway. I, you know, had to interact with, you know, the community outside of my neighborhood. And one of the things we would notice, and at times we actually do it just for fun to see what would happen, is, you know, when we walk past white people, they clutch their bags a little bit tighter. I know when we would cross the street, we would hear the click of the car locks. And I often thought, that's not innate behavior. So who teaches that? You know, who teaches you that when a Black person walks across the street or walks past you, remember to clutch your bag a little bit tighter or make sure your door is locked? You know, and so I keep going back to this Black history and you know, Black body and the history, because the history is taught and retaught and reinforced, you know. You know, and this idea of fear, you know, and it's not just white, you know, we're talking about police officers, you know, again, growing up in New York City in the South Bronx, you know, one of the things we felt was, you know, police were sometimes bad, Black police were worse. And, you know, and I don't know if he goes into it. I think he talks about this in his chapter where he talks about, can Black people be racist? My theory, you know, that, and I think there might be something that says, you know, Black police arresting Black people didn't see them the same as them. You know, it was those kind of Blacks who don't want to do anything, who don't want to get a job. I think he does talk about this, you know, there's opportunity out there, but they don't want to take advantage of it. And so they're just perpetuating, you know, these beliefs, you know?
Exactly right.
Yeah, and so here again, you know, the history just gets continued and continued. And if you're in power, you know, it gets played out.
Yeah, absolutely. And you use it, right? I mean, that's what we see happening, right? People in power. And that crime bill that we referenced is exactly an example of that. And of course, interestingly enough, he does go ahead and point out that, and I think we know this, but again, we don't. So I say it out loud, that crime bills have never correlated to crime any more than fear has correlated to actual violence, right? That adept politicians and crime entrepreneur manufacturers is what he calls them. They create the fear and stand before voters to deliver them. Because then I'm the Messiah who's going to deliver you from the violence and the crime and all the things. But the reference to that crime bill actually reminded me, and I may have mentioned this earlier, I can't remember, that in that crime bill, one of the things that they did away that was really, which was really significant, was money for inmates to go to college, right? To actually be able to do something significant with that time in order to come out and be able to be a part of society in a way that's upstanding. So, and I'm going to come right back to you, Henri, real quick, but it reminds me of the documentary I watched recently, College Behind Bars. And that's actually a modern day response, if you will, to that, right? So the idea there is, of course, we shouldn't be spending money to put people who committed crimes through college. That's ridiculous. But what the Bard College Initiative has done is shown, and they're doing this in the state of New York. Henri, you may be familiar with it, but what they've done is partnered with the New York State penitentiary system, and they're offering a college degree track for both a 2-year college degree and a 4-year college degree. There's a very rigorous process to get through it, et cetera. But this 4-part documentary follows several men and women in different prisons who have been a part of this program. But the important part about it for this conversation is what they have shown now in their most recent studies. That started back in 2014. In their most recent studies is that, yes, in fact, so the recidivism rate, right, is about 43% on average for people who leave jail. 43% of them come back and within, I think, a year or two. I can't remember the actual, that particular stat. But with the folks who are actually completing a college degree program, either 2 or 4 year, it drops to 4%. So it's the evidence they're using to show it is worth the investment. Going back to the author of The Sum of Us, Henri, right? That if we actually do invest there, it is going to save us all money in the long run, right? So, but again, tying to that crime bill itself. Sorry, Henri, go ahead.
Oh, no. And it's fascinating you mentioned that, because I did watch that piece. And because I do live in New York, I know the story. And I don't know if I can't remember if this is something I read or it was part of the story. So why BARD comes into play. So within the state government, this funding to help the inmates go to college is part of state funding.
Yeah.
One of the state legislators made a case and actually said, well, geez, all I need to do is have my 18-year-old get arrested and he gets a college education. So he's making this case distinguishing who's getting educated on the state dime, I'll call it, versus the citizens, everyday people who have to pay the tuition for their kids to go to school. So that's what then all of a sudden, and then the thinking is, who are we truly helping? Because we know who the majority of the people in the prison system who were getting help. So that's where BARD comes in, because the funding was then chopped or maybe almost taken away. And looking at the value of the program, as you said, here's a private organization willing to come in and do the right thing. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And, with that private funding, the hope is that they build enough momentum to say, again, that argument of, in the end, everybody benefits because everybody saves money. And it's sad that we have to think about it in those terms, but if that's what gets people to make what I would call the right decision, right, about state funding, like you said, moving forward, then, that might be the thing. Of course, there's a whole other conversation then about, like, when we privatize jails, we, of course, what's the word I'm looking for? We disincentivize, right? Because once it's privatized, now you have a whole different group of people fighting to keep as many people in jail as possible. Sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, though, Janice, that I think the money piece is very interesting, and it proves once again that this whole issue of race especially in this country, I know racism is a global issue, but I often speak of this country because, of course, that's our lived experience. But when you really look at the history of this country, Black bodies have always been seen as a commodity. from the days of slavery. And the end goal was to make white America money. That's just what it is. And it continues through the prison system. You've nailed it in a sense. And it ties into, for example, there's so many ways that it's proven. You can look at the school to prison pipeline. There's a purpose for that. And that purpose is to get as many Black bodies into prisons to make money for the government. So it's a very, it's interwoven, it's very complex, but there's a very concentrated effort to do just that. And it's done at the expense of the Black body because the Black body is seen as older than it actually is, as bigger than it actually is, as stronger than it actually is, as, more dangerous than it actually is. Like, we have the root of all of this is that Blacks have been dehumanized in the eyes of white America. We are not considered as human. And we talked about that in the past podcast about how Black bodies were used in the medical field, testing on Black bodies without anesthesia because they didn't believe we felt pain. So it goes back to that very issue that we're seen as a commodity. We're not seen as human. How can Black bodies benefit us? And if they can't, then it's perfectly fine to extinguish them because they're not human.
Well, it is complex, and, so one of the things you did say about the prison system, that is very complex, and not everybody makes money, it depends on what state you're in. And if you allow privatization of prisons, which the current administration is trying to undo, that they spirited in the last 4 years. But yeah, depending on what state, I know there's southern states that they do contract and farm out inmates to do labor. Not all states do that. So it's not necessarily, it really depends on where you are.
But you'll see a correlation there, Henri, that in the states where that is the case, then school to prison pipeline is a more powerful, it happens more often. It's a very common thing. So in the areas where there is money to be made, there are a lot of concentrated efforts to ensure that money is made.
Oh, no doubt, but I'm saying in its complexity, there's just the overarching issue of, regardless of what state you are in, your physical body, will have a huge impact of whether you get caught up in this system or not, and how long you get caught up in that system or not. It's a cost. We're talking about, the sum of us and economics and looking at data. It is more cost effective to educate and have people become taxpayers than us having to compensate them housed in a congregate care system in a prison.
Yeah.
There's so much data on that, and yet why do we continue to do this other than this whole idea that we've been talking about? What does the Black body represent?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are a couple other things that are really important to me that he says in this argument, and he's so effective at just coming at this issue in this case, in this chapter of the Black body, from so many different angles to make sure he grabs you, right? If he doesn't grab you on that front, he's going to grab you on this front. And one of the things that he says, and of course this is intended to grab women, he's talking about, again, this whole chapter is through the reference through his eyes as an 8-year-old, and then as a young teenager, and the experiences he's having around in those different phases. But he talks about, being with his group of friends and having to be constantly conscious of how they're perceived as a group of young Black men in their teens walking around, right? And so he talks about that he had to, that you have to learn that, especially when you're in the vicinity of cops, because cops seem especially fearful. And he says he had to learn to keep racist police officers from getting nervous. And he goes on to say, Black people are apparently responsible for calming the fear of violent cops in the way women are supposedly responsible for calming the sexual desire of male rapists. If we don't, then we're blamed for our own assaults and ultimately our own deaths.
Absolutely. It happens even now when you hear people say you should have just complied.
Yeah.
Or you hear people say, you know, when like, I don't know, I think it's becoming more and more known, but like, I don't know how many white people understand that most, if not every Black household has the talk with their children about how to behave when encountering police officers. There's the whole idea of don't put your hands in your pocket. Make sure your hands are visible at all times. Make sure you're polite and you say things like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, where we see videos constantly of white people cursing out cops and living, brandishing weapons and living.
Yeah.
But with Black people, the minute you don't like, I can't remember his name right now, and I'm sorry to say that, but the one Black man who, though was not killed, was paralyzed because he chose to turn around and walk away from a cop and was shot in the back several times.
Yeah.
So it's those things. He's absolutely 100% spot on. From then to now, it still exists that we have to behave in a manner differently with police officers because we are seen in that way as dangerous, as, you know, disrespectful, or, you know, just, we don't have the liberty of being upset, of being angry, of cursing, of reaching for our IDs, of being licensed gun owners and letting an officer know. We still lose our lives. And the thing that's most disgusting to me about that is not just that it happens, but that the minute it happens, America falls all over itself trying to justify the officer's actions every single time. Yeah. They look for excuses. They look for reasons. It's, well, he should have done this. Why didn't he do that? And no one asks, why didn't the cop use his training? Why didn't the cop not shoot? Why? This topic is so, yeah. But I think of Tamir Rice sitting at a park playing with a toy gun, and an officer rolls up on him. And I challenge anyone out there listening who does not know who Tamir Rice is, or even if you do, go to Google Images and pull up that little boy's picture. Little boy. He looks younger than the 12 years that he had. He looks like a darn near like a toddler, so young looking. And a cop rolled up on him and in seconds took his life because he was in fear. Yeah. Because he did not see a child. He saw a grown man at 12. It's absolutely what Kendi says. It's all over the place. It's whether or not people are willing to see it and admit it. That's what it's about.
Yep.
You know, listening to this, you know, I was thinking about something else I listened to this week. I think it was another Senator Scott, in one of the southern states. And I think basically he was quoted as saying something to the effect that, within the Black Lives Matter, and, we don't, they don't care about families, and the idea of families. Right. And then they played a retort by the congresswoman from the Virgin Islands. She was on the impeachment panel for the House. I wish I could remember her name. And, and she brought home this point that we're talking, the audacity, of here a public official insinuating that Black people don't care or believe in the concept of family. And she went on to say, if not for the concept of family, the Black population would not have survived the whole process of enslavement and be here today. Exactly. But I guess it was, again, her reaction to, how dare you, as a public elected official, say this publicly, that, Black people don't care about family or the concept of family, But again, he's not the only one. And this is the historical thinking that, as we said in other examples, that gets perpetuated and perpetuated. And then we have the Johnsons and the Scotts of the world who are willing to just publicly say what they believe. And the sad part is these are the people who affect laws and policies that
Exactly.
have an influence on all of us. And maybe their displeasure or, they're not liking Black people, they don't realize the policies affects white people too.
Affects all of us. Exactly right.
It affects all of us. We talked about $15 an hour. Do you honestly think $15 an hour, increase in the minimum wage isn't going to have a great effect on everybody?
Yep, that's exactly right. I'm going to bring us back to one last point that he makes. And while I'm doing that, if the two of you would both be thinking about your final thought and or a final action that you want to offer folks to consider moving forward. And the reason I'm bringing us back here is because he has this thread around this perception of the Black body that's been manifested in so many different ways. And the most recent way we're talking about is through our criminal justice system. But then he actually brings us back to a really important piece that I'm going to use as kind of my closing, but also adding to the action items for folks to explore, because, we've put so much emphasis on Black neighborhoods, the again, manifesting the fear of, well, if I'm scared of the Black body, I should be certainly fearful of Black neighborhoods where there are lots of Black bodies living. And we have attributed for decades the increase in crime. If you're living actually in these kinds of neighborhoods, the incidents of crime are greater, et cetera. And I'm not going to go through all his stats, but he does dispel that here. And he looks at some recent studies that look back and show that not only is there not a correlation to geography in the rate of crime, but the actual correlation that exists is the stronger correlation between violent crime levels and unemployment levels. So that's actually where the correlation, when you dig into it, it's not about where you live, it's about unemployment levels. And so in all Black neighborhoods where unemployment levels are low, violent crime is also low. But in any neighborhood, Black or white, where unemployment levels are high, violent crime is higher. So that correlation, I think, is really important for people to hear, because we have all been fed this idea. And Henri, you said earlier about your own experience of people locking their car doors and clutching their purses tighter. Driving through certain neighborhoods is another experience, right? Where you start to go through a certain neighborhood and yes, the doors are locked, or that whatever behaviors exist. And all of that is based on, basically myths. All of that's based on data that actually isn't correlated, that because you're in this neighborhood, you have that. Now it is correlated, as I said, to this idea of employment. So I would encourage people, as one of the action items that I would share, to really go dig at that, right? If that's a new idea to you, if you've not heard that before, and I had not heard it before reading it in this book, then I'm going to encourage you to do that. He ends this chapter, by the way, by talking about, he says, for decades, there have been three main strategies in reducing violent crime in Black neighborhoods. Again, now we understand it's not really about the Black neighborhood, but regardless, segregationists, we've been talking about that term the whole time, who consider Black neighborhoods to be war zones, have called for tough policing and the mass incarceration of super predators, that term you brought up earlier, Melissa, that he discusses. The second one is assimilationists, who say these super predators need tough laws and tough love from mentors and fathers to civilize them. In other words, we need to fix them. It's all true, but that's okay. They can be fixed, right? And then lastly, he says, an anti-racist. Anti-racists, of course, say Black people, like all people, need more higher paying jobs within their reach, especially Black youngsters who have constantly had the highest rate of unemployment of any demographic group, topping 50% in the mid-90s. There is no such thing, of course, as a dangerous racial group, but there are, of course, he says, dangerous individuals, just like there are in any group. But he said there is the violence of racism that's manifested in policy and policing that fears the Black body. And then there is the nonviolence, if you will, again, the anti-racist perspective that does not fear the Black body, that fears, if anything, the violence of the racism that has been set on the Black body. So I'm going to come around to each of you. Melissa, I'm going to come to you first for a final thought and or any action pieces that you want people to consider moving forward. Go for it.
For me, it's really big that people pay attention. I think too much is able to slip by us or we're not aware of because we're just not paying attention. And I get it. Like, we're all living lives, we're all taking care of families and working and doing all these things. And so sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming to stay informed with every little thing that's happening. But because we're not informed, we see what we see, and things are happening the way that they're happening.
Yeah.
One thing that we haven't, a word that doesn't really get used as much, I don't know, in white America, but I certainly know that it's something that I learned in Black culture quite early in my adulthood, is propaganda, the word propaganda.
Yeah.
And I don't know that many people are aware of what that is or pay attention to it. So I guess my action item is, propaganda has to do with messaging and how messages are given. And we talked about how this same message about Black bodies has lived throughout history and been given to us throughout history, and how now, as a result, we're all perpetuating that idea. People need to understand that these messages are not just messages that are blatantly stated, as the podcast we listened to from Henri, but it's subtly woven into all kinds of messages that we receive, whether it is through these police getting acquitted, that sends the message, but it's even in our entertainment. It's even in our, on our magazine covers. Like a while back, there was a thing of a photo on a cover of a magazine, and I apologize that I'm not able to give specifics, but it had LeBron James and a white lady on the cover, but depicting the scene from King Kong, where he was portrayed as the big Black man and she was the little white woman. And I'll have to get that so I can send it to the two of you.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of blowback about that on social media. I remember several years ago, because here we are again reinforcing that belief and that stereotype. So I just want people to pay attention to messaging. That's important. It's important that we are aware of these messages, because we can't change what we're not aware of, and we can't challenge what we don't see or what we don't admit. So if we're looking for these messages, then we can debunk them. So that would be the biggest takeaway I have, is that. And as Henri said in the very, very beginning, if you're not speaking, if you're complicit, then you're just as guilty. So not just seeing the messages for yourself, but pointing them out to others that you care about, so that you can open their eyes and potentially have discussions around this, so that we can break these cycles.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that, Melissa. Thank you for that. Henri, what are you thinking?
Oh, a wealth of things. But, I thank you both for the compliment. But man, there are things I don't even get to that I wish I could. I just don't have the time, or there's so many other competing things. So I sometimes feel lucky I get what I get.
Yeah, that's fair.
But as I'm listening to the two of you wrap up, I'm thinking of a couple of things. Data. A lot of times when we really want to question what we're hearing, go to the data. And as he's shown in the book, if you look at the data and you look at the right type of comparisons, let's look at the economics of this, jobs, people being employed, and look at those in fair comparisons, you'll see a very different story than what's being portrayed at times. And as you were saying that, it made me think, talk about the media. Even in the media, I can't think of any movie that depicted some inner city scenario with Black people selling crack that at some point you didn't hear, well, we're doing this because we ain't got jobs and we need money.
Yeah.
I mean, so the message is out there.
Yeah.
It's always
That's a
been
very
out
good
there.
point.
Even in the movies, it's been out there. You talk about light versus dark and bodies. I was listening to a Larry Wilmore interview with Lee. I wish I could remember his name. He's the director of the United States versus Billie Holiday. He did Monster Ball.
Oh, okay.
He was director of Monster Ball. But anyway, Larry Wilmore was talking about even in the media, and he says, think about the Planet of the Apes. And I'm like, my ears perk up, Planet of the Apes. And he says, yeah, in the Planet of the Apes, if you looked at the mean apes, they seem to be darker than the nice ape. Like the nice apes, they were lighter fur, colored fur.
Yes.
Yep.
The mean
Yes.
aggressive apes were dark furred.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I never really thought about that.
Yep.
But was that a subtle message somehow even being conveyed in the Planet of the Apes,
Yep.
But, I'll end on this and something you said, Melissa. There is a sense of complicity on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
When you talk about why aren't we hearing these stories, some of the people I do listen to bring that point home all the time. Where is the media in terms of truly reporting these type of stories? The stories that we really do need to hear. And at times, both sides don't do a really good, fair job of reporting what we all need to hear.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you for that.
So
That's an important reminder.
Yeah, the best I can say is question things, check the data, but do the best you can. You can't get it all.
No, I think that's a really fair way to, and that I appreciate that, because it is, our intention here, of course, is to create a sense of urgency among people. And so I think it's important that we're tempering it in the way. The couple of things that I'm going to add to that list are, again, trying to think about actions at the micro and macro level. But even simply, if you've listened to this podcast, you've taken a step, right? That was an action that you took to inform thinking and to be better informed. So we would ask that you consider some of the things you've heard, right? What are your own beliefs about crime? How have you fallen under the kind of structure of myths that have been created for us for, again, decades? And how have those beliefs about crime changed as a result of listening to us today? You could also do something as simple as share one thing from this podcast with somebody else, right? Something that really is striking you. Maybe it was a quote from the book. Maybe it was something one of us said. Share it with somebody else and have a conversation about it. And then lastly, and I say this because he talked so much about his relationship with his parents and parental fear. And Melissa, you talked about the idea of in every Black family, there comes a point where you have the talk with kids. So have a conversation with your own kids. What are their beliefs about the Black body? What do they already, at whatever age they are, do they already have some messaging that's been absorbed that makes them think certain ways? Whether your kids are Black or white or brown or, whatever, it doesn't matter. Have that conversation with them. Be aware of the messaging they've already received. Next week, we're going to shift then to the next chapter in Kendi's book, and that chapter is going to be about culture. I'm really looking forward to that because I'm an educator, and of course in schools, we're putting so many resources, time, people, programs toward this idea of culture in schools. And so I haven't read ahead, and I'm anxious to see what I learn here from him around this idea of culture and how it informs my thinking about culture in general. And certainly, of course, because of my role, culture in schools. So between now and then, of course, everyone like, subscribe, share. Those are the simple things you can do to take action to better inform yourselves. We appreciate all of your listening. We appreciate, of course, you sharing with the folks in your life that you think might benefit from just listening to this conversation. And of course, join us next time and we'll get to it.